Hi Mano, maray na hapon.
Maray na aga from here.
Actually, maray na aga dyan. Maray na banggi na digdi from the other side. It's great to see
The
you.
Great to see you as well. At the furthest part of the former British Empire.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Ni inutan sa mo yung oras digdi though. So, banggi na.
Kaya
Yeah.
pasensya
And,
na huro halaba ini.
ay, problema. Ay, problema. Always a pleasure to moderate your lectures.
Ay, thank
Okay.
you. Ano man sana? Sharing sana, sharing.
Sharon. Ayo, puun ko tayo in 2 minutes, Mano. 2 minutes.
Sige, okay.
Thank you. Diyos maray na hapon po sa Indugabos. Diyos maray na aga sa satuyang plenary speaker. Hali digdi sa Melbourne, Australia. Diyos maray na banggina. Thank you very much for staying with us. We have reached the last part of day one of Durungán, the third Saysay Bikol conference. Thank you very much for those who are tuned in on YouTube and then our participants here on Zoom. Diyos mabalos po sa indong pag-anduyog sa pangatulong conference na kan Saysay Bicol. So for this afternoon, we are very honored to have a good friend and a collaborator of Saysay Bicol. He's done lectures with us a few times in the past and has published an article in Saysay, the Journal of Bicol History. It's actually uploaded on the Cambridge repository. Medyo kadakol ng download, so medyo mahiwas na ang reach kang Saysay Journal ninhuli sa iyang article no, na naka-upload sa Cambridge. So, our plenary speaker for this afternoon is a Shulman Research Fellow from Trinity Hall, Cambridge. And he's going to present a paper titled Secularism as Sovereignty in Philippine Church State Relations, 1565 to 1910s. So, without any further ado, let me now call on Mr. Jethro or Dr. Jethro Kalakdair.
Diyos marahay na aga hali digdi sa Cambridge. Gabo sa Indo. Diyos marahay na hapon dyan ah, sa Bicol, sa Pilipinas. Sin Diyos marahay na banggi kay Jai sa Australia. Dako lang pagmabalo sa pag-imbitar sa kuya. Dahil ko in-expect na ako pala nan ma-plenary. Kaya pagpasensyahan po nindoan sa kuyang papel ta huruhala ba ini. So gusto nang magmirindal na sana po kamo habang nagdadangog kamo kaining lecture ko. Minaabot ko kuta na na ipalis sa Bicol ang papel na ini, alaga dahil na ako nin oras, kaya pagpasensyahan na sa natabi nindo na ako mataram nin English. Ma-code switching na sana ako sa Bicol. Sa taud-taod kung may mga kaypuan na klaruhon. Okay. Secularization has become deeply entrenched in the writing of history, seemingly impossible to disentangle from modernity in the interpretation of change over time. Max Weber laid the foundations of the secularization thesis by proposing that the disenchantment of the world was the first step towards what he imagined as secular modernity. Disenchantment, he argued, began in the 16th century Reformation and influenced the Protestant ethos of work that was conducive to the emergence of capitalism. More recent intellectuals, such as Charles Taylor, built on this Weberian thesis, although Taylor has argued through Catholic thinkers rather than Protestant ones. The emergence of the secular world from an enchanted, or rather religious, past has informed modern accounts of the emergence of the nation. Benedict Anderson postulated that the imagined community subsists in secular, or rather homogeneous, empty time. Whereas within the realm of the older religious community, time was reckoned to have prophetic, transcendent meaning, time in the imagined community is secular and is measured simply by clock and calendar. The nexus linking secularization with modernity, Protestantism, and capitalism has yielded what Herbert Butterfield, writing in the context of England, pithily termed Whiggish history. Not a few scholars of religion, chief among them the sociologist Jose Casanova, have rejected this path teleology, citing the resurgence of religion in public spaces in the contemporary world. The study of world Christianity, which emerged systematically in the 1990s, has made us aware that Christianity, long considered as synonymous with European imperialism and expansion, has shifted its center of gravity from the West to the post-colonial global South. South Asian scholars, for their part, have critiqued the sweeping narrative of capital and Western nationalism by highlighting specificity and difference over global homogeneity that had relegated the global South to the waiting room of history, to borrow Chakrabarti. Such critique of modernity has implications to the status of religion within the trajectory of secular nationalism. Pace Anderson, Partha Chatterjee averred that, at least in the context of India, anti-colonial nationalism, quote, declares the domain of the spiritual as its sovereign territory and refuses to allow the colonial power to intervene in that domain, end quote. It was this internal spiritual domain that posed the challenge against the outside material domain of the colonial state, quote, where the West had proved its superiority and the East had succumbed, end quote. Now, the goal of this paper is not to argue that the secularization narrative is wrong, given the experience of the global South or the resurgence of religion, but to rethink secularization as historically having been partly induced by the state's governance of religion. This paper takes as its working definition of secularism that which was evocatively defined by Tisa Wenger, who was my mentor at Yale, and Sylvester Johnson. Quote, secularism is the set of cultural and political systems that demarcate and govern religion. Or, in other words, the systematic ordering of knowledge and power that puts religion in its place. End quote. Thus, the privatization of religion and its evacuation from public life can be understood as one of other forms by which religion is managed by the state. To understand how this process was operationalized, this paper focuses on the Philippines, an archipelago that has experienced three distinct governmental regimes with distinct religious policies from the 16th to the 20th centuries, namely the Spanish Empire from 1565 to 1898, the short-lived Philippine Republic from 1898 to around 1900, and the American colonial regime, 1898 to 1946. Long considered a periphery, not only by historical empires, but by current scholarship itself, the Philippines provides a singular case to rethink secularism in history, thus highlighting the persistence of the state's governance of religion rather than a simple march from religion to its absence. Using the history of church state relations in the Philippines, this paper argues that secularism should be understood not simply as the retreat of religion from politics, but as the state's governance of religion. It examines how the Spanish Empire, the Philippine Republic, and the American colonial state governed religion, specifically the Catholic Church, within shifting historical and political contexts. The Spanish colonial state's dependence on the friars as the main agents of colonial control produced institutional incoherence, which was a constitutive feature of its functioning. That incoherence eventually became unsustainable and in part led to the outbreak of the Philippine Revolution in 1896. The Filipino revolutionary government in 1898 asserted sovereignty not only in political but also religious matters, attempting to make the management of religion more coherent. It was US rule in the beginning of the 20th century that imposed some semblance of order on church state relations through a more assertive exercise of secular power. Ultimately, this history sheds light on how the control of religion was reincarnated in different epochs. Now, the history of religion and politics in the Philippines has, in fact, been framed as a history of secularization, as I have pointed out elsewhere. The pundit Carmen Guerrero Nakpil formulated a witty, though grossly inaccurate epigram to that effect. Quote, 3 centuries in a Catholic convent and 50 years in Hollywood, end quote. Indeed, the secularization narrative comes to the fore in reference to the emergence of the American colonial rule, although general, nationalist, and leftist overviews point to the outbreak of the Philippine Revolution in 1896 as the starting point for the disentanglement of church and state. Consequently, sociologists, political scientists, and legal scholars who employ the lens of normativity parse what secularization means in a predominantly Catholic country and why it hasn't reached its fullest potential yet. Evidently, much of Philippine scholarship on religion today has Whiggish overtones. To a certain extent, the secularization narrative correctly accounts for the distinct ways that different regimes in the Philippines approach religion. Whilst the Spanish friars commanded a great deal of influence under Spanish rule, they lost that influence when the Catholic Church was disestablished and the freedom of religion was proclaimed by the Americans and to a certain extent the First Philippine Republic. However, the secularization narrative in Philippine history has its limits. First, accepting at face value the transition from religion to its supposed absence risks viewing the Spanish Catholic past as a monolithic period of fusion between church and state. But the Spanish imperial project was far from a complete success, and in fact, harmony between church and state in the Spanish Empire was an exception rather than the rule. Second, the secularization narrative uncritically valorizes American secularism as the telos of a historical trajectory that emerges from a supposed medieval past. But to consider the American period as the opposite of the Spanish rehashes the leyenda negra, the black legend, and in turn obscures how techniques of domination were shared between two empires, overlooking the persistence of Spanish Catholic influence under the aegis of America. To overcome this impasse, it is necessary to adopt the view that secularism is primarily the ambition of the state to regulate religion, as had been argued by Talal Asad, Saba Mahmood, Hussein Ali Agrama, to name a few. A reconsideration of church state history in the Philippines and elsewhere must think about sovereignty since ultimately it is the sovereign state and not the church that enforces the separation between them. Let me repeat that. Ultimately, it is the sovereign state and not the church that enforces the separation between them. And states are able to exercise sovereignty over religions, in this case the Catholic Church, precisely because the religions such as the Catholic Church are institutions, or if we follow the scholar Naomi Goldenberg, vestigial states. Religions are vestigial states that are, quote, institutional and cultural remainders of former sovereignties surviving within the jurisdictions of contemporary governments, end quote. Indeed, as Patricio Abinales has insightfully pointed out in the context of the Philippines, the church is comparable to the state because it behaves like one. This is not to deny other aspects of religion, such as belief, but this paper shifts focus on religion qua institution and secularism as governance to track how religion works within empire and state formations. In the same way that religion is not a thing, empire is not simply a collective of overseas territories, but signifies a kind of relationship based on a differentiation of power. Imperialism and secularism converge because they are two regimes of power or processes that frame how power is exercised and how sovereignty is asserted. Thus, in the Philippines, the Spanish Patronato Real, the ecclesiastical policies of the Philippine Revolution, and American church state separation appear as reconfigurations of that same governing power. Lastly, this paper gestures towards a preliminary reconsideration of the narrative of Philippine history, namely that of the weak state. Because of the emphasis on the governing aspect of secularism, conflicts between church and state are here understood to be essentially competing assertions of sovereignty, hence the use of the rubric of coherence and incoherence in the analysis that will follow. Coherence in this paper is understood as the measure or of the degree of control, or rather sovereignty, that the state was able to exercise over the church. Incoherence, meanwhile, is a relative descriptor rather than an index of distortion. In the context of Spanish rule in the Philippines, administrative incoherence was fundamental to the very system of church and state that lasted for over 3 centuries. It was not a defect per se, but a peculiarly productive feature. Indeed, as Horacio de la Costa argued, church state conflict in the Spanish regime was constructive. Sorry, church state conflicts in the Spanish regime were constructive and were a sign of vigorous vitality. But whilst de la Costa considered such vitality to have preserved church and state as a priori autonomous societies that remained in spite of their union themselves, to quote de la Costa, I view these conflicts as essentially negotiations of what constituted as church and state. The weakness of the state and the coherence or incoherence of secular power were neither uniform nor foreordained because the boundary separating church and state and the very jurisdictions of the civil and the ecclesiastical were constantly being redefined. These negotiations call into question the imagined completeness and perfection of the very realms, or perhaps jurisdictions, of church and state in the history of the Philippine Islands and elsewhere. Now, what follows is a longue durée discussion of how the state's power to govern religion manifested at different epochs of Philippine history, and certain episodes in this history have been selected to illustrate the phenomenon. Okay, moving on. The history of church-state relations in the Philippines cannot be understood without first understanding the Patronato Real or Patronato Regio, royal patronage, the peculiar system of church-state union in the Spanish Empire. It was a system that granted almost exclusive privileges to the Spanish monarchy over ecclesiastical appointments and property, often at the expense of the independence of the papacy. As such, the patronato could be thought of as, I've used this term elsewhere, an archaic form of secularism. The patronato, to clarify, did not begin as a fixed system in the 16th century, contrary to what seems to be the prevailing interpretation within Philippine historiography. Instead, the patronato was, quote, a large body of rights and privileges in the Indies based on a number of extraordinary papal grants whose interpretation expanded over time. Patronage was an established juridical practice in medieval Spain by which benefactors or patrons who founded benefices were granted the privilege to select the incumbents for said benefices. With the Reconquista and the eventual overseas expansion of the Spanish Empire from the late 15th to the 16th centuries, this patronal model was expediently adopted for the Spanish monarchy in a broader way, with a view towards evangelizing and in the process civilizing non believers, beginning with Granada in Spain in 1486. Later on, this initial model was expanded by the Spaniard Pope Alexander VI to the New World in two papal bulls that donated lands to be discovered by the Spanish Catholic monarchs and thereafter granted to these same monarchs the right to exact tithes from newly subjugated peoples for the maintenance of the church in the Indies. Now, at the instigation of Ferdinand II, Fernando el Católico, Pope Julius II in 1508 conceded to the Spanish crown the definitive privilege over ecclesiastical appointments, the right over the collection of tithes, and the autonomy from papal interference in the affairs of the New World. Notwithstanding its initial missionary thrust, the expansion of royal patronage under the Habsburgs was driven by regalist interpretations that asserted the monarch's exclusive, inherent, and inalienable authority over ecclesiastical affairs, thus restricting the powers of the papacy from which these privileges had originally been derived. The publication of the jurist Juan de Solórzano Pereira's De Indiarum Iure in 1639 and the eventual publication of the Recopilación de Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias in 1681 codified the body of law and jurisprudence of royal patronage in the New World. Consequently, the king was increasingly being regarded no longer simply a patron of the church, but a de facto apostolic delegate or even royal vicar who possessed immense ecclesiastical powers excepting sacramental ones. Nevertheless, the patronato of the Indies was more encompassing than that of the mainland, since the patronage of the latter pertained solely to the bishoprics rather than all ecclesiastical benefices, as was the case in the empire. Spanish regalist ideations from the 16th century onwards developed in parallel to the Erastianism of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, that advocated not simply for the ultimate power of the state to determine ecclesiastical decisions, but also the idea of church state relations within a single sphere rather than two separate jurisdictions of church and state. However, whilst the Spanish and English systems had similar statist tendencies, the patronato system still maintained the separate sphere or jurisdiction of the church, conformable to prevailing Tridentine ecclesiology, notwithstanding the Spanish state's attempts at supremacy. Beyond the written ideals of the patronato that intended the efficiency of the colonial enterprise was a state of utter institutional anomie and governmental incoherence in the Philippines. The scholar John D. Blanco perceptibly argues that because of frontier colonial expediencies, the Spanish regime's delegation of its power to the church in the Philippines was often at variance with the legal and ecclesiastical ideals set by Madrid. This reliance was first incarnated in the frontier missionary work undertaken under the Habsburgs that maintained its sovereignty through, quote, an extremely loose, flexible administration based upon the centered and heterogeneous forms of authority in constant flux and negotiation, end quote. Indeed, answering the call to a conquista espiritual were the Augustinians, who arrived in 1565, the Franciscans in 1578, the Dominicans in 1587, and the Augustinian Recollects in 1606. The Jesuits arrived in 1581, were expelled by the monarchy in 1768, and restored only in 1859 in the Philippines. With very few exceptions, no natives were admitted to these orders under the Spanish regime. The missionaries were tasked not only to proclaim the gospel, but to help the regime establish and settle the colony. They were immersed in the world of the natives, mastering the many local languages and possessing what one Spanish governor general termed the art of dominating the Indio spirit. Consequently, given the absence of lay functionaries throughout the Spanish colonial period, the delegation of secular power to the ministers of the church was not simply a system of state weakness, but an expedient projection of Spanish sovereignty via the patronato. The patronato immediately engendered a state of administrative incoherence, with church and state competing for sovereignty in the first decades of Spanish colonial rule. Specifically, as De La Costa had earlier diagnosed, the permanent causes of church state conflicts in the islands were the expansive role given to the colonial episcopate, the encroachment of civil power on the ecclesiastical, and the exceptional privileges granted to the religious orders. These three were overlapping areas of jurisdiction, as the historian J.H. Eliot summarized it in the context of Mexico, or in the context of this paper, competing assertions of sovereignty. Several of these conflicts involved ecclesiastical immunity, immunitas, which ended drastically and resulted, for instance, in the banishment of the Dominican Archbishop of Manila, Felipe Pardo, in 1683, and the assassination of Governor General Fernando Bustamante in 1719. The First Synod of Manila in 1582 perfectly encapsulates how the Patronato and its incoherence operated, exposing the negotiations of ecclesiastical and civil authorities in a colonial frontier. The synod, or junta as it was termed in the extant documentation, was convoked by the first bishop of the Philippines, the Dominican friar Domingo de Salazar, who arrived in Manila in 1581, less than 2 decades after the Spanish conquest was systematically initiated in 1565. In Manila, Salazar established a cathedral that was in reality, quoting De La Costa, a low shed with roof and walls of nipa that lacked a sacristy for the priest to vest in, end quote. Conventional clerical historiography has only focused on the Manila Synod's advocacy for justice for the natives against abusive Spanish conquistadores, as well as its attempts to justify Spanish presence in the archipelago beyond simple conquest. But as Natalie Cobo has recently argued, the Synod deployed moral theology and confession in the spirit of the School of Salamanca to regulate the behavior of Spanish colonizer towards the natives. In the process, Salazar asserted the authority of the Catholic Church to do so, although he himself, Salazar himself, rejected state interference in ecclesiastical matters. The presence of conquistador or encomendero abuses suggests a state of anomy then prevailing in the colonial frontier. In a letter to Philip II in 1582, Salazar protested that lay Spaniards forced the natives to backbreaking labor, such as the cutting of timber and the rowing of ships, coerced the payment of tribute at a time when the native economy was one of subsistence, and, failing at these, seized the property of the natives, all of which were done indiscriminately and often violently. What is crucial to understand is that Salazar framed these abuses as instances of Spaniards failing to obey the orders of the King of Spain. For instance, Salazar complained that the king's order to abolish slavery was not being applied by colonial functionaries. Thus, he bemoaned these cruelties to Philip II by despairing that His Majesty was so far away from the islands to provide a remedy to his subjects' contravention of royal decrees, to the point that Spanish presence in the islands was being misconstrued by the natives as subjugation rather than evangelization. In the colonial periphery, Salazar seized upon the absence of firm secular authority to impose some semblance of coherence that, conforming with Salamantine and Tridentine ideals, buttressed both Spanish church and state, claiming the identification of ecclesiastical law with royal will. This was evident in the surviving documentation of the 1582 Synod of Manila, which was convoked by Salazar ostensibly to justify the conquest and to allay the consciences of the Spaniards involved in it by formulating a guide for confessors in the absolution of sins. And yet, despite being an ecclesiastical meeting, the synod's prescriptions were primarily quote unquote secular. The document enlisted the duties and norms of behavior expected of colonial officials from the governor down to the encomendero, condemning forced labor, demanding justice for the natives, and most of all, ordering the restitution in solidum of what the Spaniards had forcibly sequestered from the natives. Now, the nucleus of these injunctions was in the justification of the conquest, a justification that employed a mutually constituting argument for the presence of both the Catholic Church and the Spanish state, rather than a justification solely based on religious ideals, as current studies tend to argue. These studies, you could read them, authored by J. Gallo Aragon, a Dominican friar, in times past. Now, indeed, mirroring the arguments for the Patronato, Salazar contended that Spanish presence in the islands had but one purpose: evangelization. All power came from Christ, and the king was impelled by that divine power to propagate the gospel. But evangelization was predicated on the condition that one, there was a good government, buen gobierno, that could facilitate evangelization, and two, a people capable of understanding the supernatural. The synod concluded that neither of these conditions were met. First, as they pointed out, the natives and their customs were so barbaric and their laws were those of the devil that a new government must be installed to facilitate the work of evangelization, that government being the Spanish one. Second, according to the synod, the natives were, quote, incapable, base, or immoral, and of such little worth, end quote, to be entrusted with, quote, the matters of our faith, or the lofty and admirable form of government, end quote. These matters, the synod argued, were what, quote, the Respublica Cristiana maintains even in purely secular affairs, into which the spiritual order to which it is directed is interwoven. The synod's justification, as I see it, was clearly circular rather than linear. Evangelization was the only reason for Spanish expansion, but evangelization could only be done if certain civilizational and governmental conditions were met. Taken further, Catholic evangelization and Hispanic good governance were only possible when the barbaric and demonic government and religion of the natives were displaced and superseded. Church and state, in the mind of Salazar and the Synod, were mutually constitutive as they were interwoven, with their boundaries open to reinterpretation and negotiation, contraction and expansion, thus breeding overlapping jurisdictions and administrative incoherence that were foundational to the very existence of Spanish colonial rule. Consequently, such administrative incoherence was sustained by the missionaries, who perpetuated the status of the Philippines by their own estimation as an ecclesiastical frontier. The religious clergy, or priests belonging to religious orders, obtained omni-moda privileges that made them immune to episcopal jurisdiction, pitting them and their superiors against the bishops, who were mostly from the religious orders themselves. The ideal ecclesiology of the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church that emphasized the power of the bishops and the role of the secular or diocesan clergy subject to them was not completely realized in the Philippines, partly because of the Patronato and partly because of the failure of the Spanish Church to graduate its Philippine ward towards what they would consider as ecclesiastical maturation. The Filipino Jesuit historian John N. Schumacher considered the 18th century as the golden age of Philippine Catholicism, the period in which natives increasingly participated in the life of the institutional church, specifically entering the secular priesthood. However, beyond Manila and other centers of colonial life, Catholicism remained in its missionary stage. Schumacher himself even identified the twisted growth of the native clergy and the persistence of syncretism as evidence of a decline in the quality of Philippine Catholicism that persisted to the end of Spanish rule in 1898. Now, putting an end to the flexibility of Habsburg rule, the Bourbon reforms of the mid 18th century put regalism at a higher gear, thereby enabling the monarchy to aggressively assert its power over the church. Various ecclesiastical reforms were applied by the king to the effect of subjecting the church under royal control, limiting the previous privileges obtained by the religious orders, and assiduously governing the wealth of the church. The historian D.A. Brading aptly framed these reforms as the assault on Baroque Catholicism by enlightened despotism in the 18th century. Nevertheless, recent examinations have convincingly nuanced this overall characterization by paying attention to how individual bishops in the empire straddled both royal pretensions to absolute power and the ideals set by the Council of Trent. As part of this reformist and regalist thrust, in 1753, the universal patronage, or Patronato Universal, of the Spanish monarchy was extended to all the bishoprics in the imperial mainland. The Patronato Royal, therefore, was formulated in the Indies before it was repatriated back to the imperial center in a more formidable form. In the Philippines, the Bourbon reforms were aggressively applied by Archbishop Basilio Sancho de Santa Justa y Rufina, who oversaw the expulsion of the Jesuits from the Spanish realms in 1767. Sancho was also responsible for the rapid secularization of the parishes, that is, the transfer of parishes from the regular clergy to the diocesan clergy, which necessitated the indiscriminate ordination of ill prepared native candidates for the priesthood. Later on, the short lived liberal regime in the peninsula that birthed the Constitution of Cadiz unleashed in 1812 unleashed a spirit of liberalism that made the policy of depending on the friars as agents of colonial rule look backward. Now, notwithstanding attempts at state rationalization and indeed coherence, by the 19th century, Spain delicately, yet more explicitly, incentivized the friars to work on behalf of the empire in the Philippines. Whereas the Bourbon reforms in the wider empire assaulted the regular clergy, in the Philippines, the regular clergy were the main engines that reflected royal will. Following the loss of its American colonies in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, special laws were instituted by Madrid that preserved the Philippine friars' privileges and shielded them from liberal and statist or anti-clerical measures introduced in the peninsula. Government overtly transformed the friars into state functionaries to use their influence over the people and keep the Philippines Spanish. The friar thus became, in the words of our dear Bishop Francisco Gainza, the helper of government and, quote, the mediator between civil authority and the people, end quote, who initiated and prompted projects both religious and secular. The parish priest was the de facto administrator of towns, since the people and their leaders were, quote, accustomed to live content under his paternal direction, end quote. Now, within the municipality, the parish priest oversaw education, public health, charities, taxation, the budget, and the registry. Within the broader province, the curate had a say in public works and the partition of crown lands called realengas, and he exercised considerable influence in the censorship of printed materials and theatrical performances. Filipino nationalists such as Marcelo H. del Pilar termed this 19th century phenomenon as phrilocracia, or rule by friars. Now we have to understand that phrilocracia was not there at the beginning, but it only developed uh, more formidably in the 19th century. The well-known 1842 Informe Secreto of the Spanish diplomat Sinibaldo de Mas articulated the reactionary parameters of phrilocracia in full detail, although Mas collectively sketched these out as a foil to his actual liberal proposals. Now, one of the main principles underscoring Mas's reactionary set of policies was that, quote, people of color must voluntarily respect and obey the whites, end quote. The effectuation of this principle involved not only the reduction of the population of the Creoles, who were at the forefront of the anti-colonial revolutions in Latin America, but also the imposition of racial discrimination within the church that preferred Spanish friars over native and Creole clergymen for the maintenance of colonial rule. Mas wrote that it was, quote, necessary to provide that a Spanish cura be placed in each village, and it is preferable to leave a village without a minister rather than to place it in charge of a Filipino secular priest, because the bond of religion between the metropole and the colony was, quote, very powerful and may induce the islanders to love and defend the Spanish domination as a duty, end quote. Mas excluded the native and Creole clergy, upon whom he impinged many supposedly natural faults. Although he identified the one fault of the friar as that of meddling in temporal matters, or, quote, of endeavoring to abrogate all jurisdictions and then assume these in themselves, end quote, Mass immediately excused this defect as, quote, one of the least, since, quote, our chief and vital object be considered to be the conservation of the state, end quote. Thus, Mass wrote, and I'm quoting, it is not a fact that, is it not a fact that, for España to maintain this colony under these persons as instruments, their influence must be positive. The alcaldes and other employees must be the wheels of the machine, who must be in communication with the Spanish friar parish priest, and to a certain point move at their impulse. So long as the villages obey the voice of the friars, the islands will be Spanish, for the friars can do no less than be so. End quote. Now, the 19th century secularization controversy, the transfer of parishes from the regular to the secular clergy, tested the limits and exposed the convolution of Spain's reliance on what Filomeno Aguilar calls friar power. Almost all ecclesiastical actions depended on the government's fiat, and given the pressing concern of preserving the colony, Madrid continued to depend on the friars to uphold imperial sovereignty. In return, the friars were able to monopolize the parishes of the islands for themselves, especially those that were desirably lucrative or rich. Although the secular clergy gained increased parochial control following the state's enforcement of secularization in the middle of the 18th century, beginning in 1826, royal cedulas were issued in succession to the effect of dispossessing secular priests of parishes in favor of the four friar orders of Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, and Augustinian Recollects. Informed by arguments from canon law, especially the Council of Trent, the secular clergy, comprising mainly of natives, Creoles, and mestizos, demanded equal rights and preference in the administration of these parishes. The unjust discrimination triggered the campaign of Filipino clergymen for the secularization of the parishes, with the celebrated Creole priest Dr. Pedro Pelaez of the Cabildo or chapter of the Manila Cathedral at its helm. After his death in 1863, Pelaez was succeeded by the brilliant young cleric Dr. Jose Burgos. Whilst on the surface only ecclesiastical or intramural, the secularization controversy was as much about the state as it was about the church, since secularization could only be achieved within the framework of the patronato. Inspired by the 1851 Concordat between Spain and the Holy See, in which it was agreed that the authority of the episcopate in the Spanish realm was to be respected by the state, Spanish Catholic bishops in the Philippines aligned with the seculars in asserting episcopal authority over regular parish priests and subjecting them to removability, amovilidad, at the will of the bishop, ad nutum episcopi. The Dominican bishop Francisco Gainta Escobas of Nueva Cáceres, a friend of Pilaeth, was a leading figure in the introduction of reforms to the Philippine Catholic Church that cumulatively sought to reduce the overwhelming independence of the friars from the bishop's authority. But this reformism was immediately met with the most acerbic opposition by Gainza's fellow friars, who objected to what they saw as episcopal encroachment on what they believed to be irrevocable privileges granted to them by the Spanish state and the Holy See. Confronted with the dilemma of colonial preservation and canonical injunction, on top of adhering to racialized logics, Gainza himself initiated the demotion of many of his native priests in Nueva Cáceres to secondary positions. To keep native priests loyal to Spain, Gainza removed the native clergy from control of the seminary and replaced them with Spanish Lazarists or Vincentians. The clamor for ecclesiastical secularization became much more complicated as it was increasingly implicated in the politics of liberalism and reformism taking hold of wider Philippine society. Padre Burgos formed informal alliances with liberal groups and, in outrightly demanding equality between Spaniard and Filipino, recast this secularization issue as a proto-nationalist one. Implicitly, he also sought the power of the state to enforce the secularization of the parishes. The arrival of the liberal Governor General Carlos Maria de la Torre in 1869 was widely acclaimed by Filipino liberals, and especially Burgos, who was hopeful to find an ally for his cause. Torre introduced limited reforms, such as the reduction of press censorship, but these reforms did not last. Torres' successor in 1871, General Rafael Izquierdo, a liberal in the peninsula and a devout Freemason, ruled the islands with ferocious conservatism. A revolt in Fort San Felipe in Cavite broke out on the 20th of January 1872, orchestrated by Filipino laymen as part of a planned separatist revolution. In response, Izquierdo ruthlessly punished the insurrectionists and, taking advantage of the situation, targeted Burgos and his clerical movement, since the Filipino clergy, in their opposition to friar power, had increasingly been considered as enemies of the Spanish regime. Despite the lack of evidence linking Burgos to the uprising, Izquierdo expedited his conviction along with Filipino priest Jacinto Zamora and Mariano Gomez. The three were publicly garroted on the 17th of February 1872 as a warning to anyone who dared to push for reforms. The real instigators, however, were saved by Izquierdo from the scaffold, simply from the gallows, simply because they were his fellow Masons. Izquierdo's main task of preserving the colony for Spain overrode his personal beliefs to the point of allying himself with the friars that he detested in Spain. As historians Maria Dolores Elizalde and Javier Watts de Lamps have emphasized, I'm sorry, my French is not very good, an uneasy balance of power was maintained by the friars and subsequent governors general of whatever political persuasion until the end of Spanish rule in 1898. Now, in 1872, Bishop Gainza warned the government that executing the clergymen would lead to the, quote, end of the Catholic clergy with the loss of its prestige and the consequent struggle for country, end quote. Whilst supposedly evidencing Gainza's progressivism, the statement was in reality an advice to uphold the delicate balance of power between church and state in the colony, reminding the government of the immunity of the clergy from secular courts. Gainza's warning was an ironic attempt to call the Spanish government back to an imagined equilibrium. The execution of the three clerics in 1872 introduced Filipinos as a third force in the issue of church, state, and sovereign control in the Philippines. Accordingly, the contradictions of Spanish colonial policy could no longer be contained. The propaganda movement, the succeeding generation of Filipino nationalists active around 1880 to 1895, identified friar power as a force to be destroyed to foster colonial reform, and as some of them ideated, independence from Spain. For the propaganda, institutional incoherence could be remedied through assimilation and the coherent application of Spanish policy. Now, the propaganda movement called the attention of the Spanish government in Madrid and Manila to the backwardness of a colonial policy dependent on unrestrained friar power. Diagnosing the ills of Spanish colonial rule, Jose Rizal depicted the overbearing nature of the friar in his novel Noli Me Tangere, which was published in Berlin in 1887. The novel, of course, earned the ire of the friars and the government in Manila. It was eventually censored and banned. The younger brother of a priest active in the secularization campaign, Marcelo H. del Pilar was the most acerbic of the Spanish friars' critics. Pilar had the avowed goal of expelling the friars from the Philippines with the help of associates, and with the help of associates, he organized anti-friar activities and published anti-friar propaganda. But more important than mere anti-friar propagandizing was the Ilustrado invocation of state power in their campaign to modernize colonial governance and make the Spanish colonial project more coherent. Although written primarily as part of its anti-friar campaign, several articles in La Solidaridad, which included those written by the staunchly anti-clerical Pilar, echo the call of previous decades for the state to enforce the secularization of the parishes. One particularly important point of debate was the church's share in internal revenue. Government provided both the priest's basic salary and the funds for the upkeep of the parochial church building called the Fondos de Fabrica. The tribute system of taxation, which was in effect until 1884, provided the church funds through the payment of a separate tax called the sanctorum, which was the source of the Fondos de Fabrica. The salary of the priest, meanwhile, was proportionate to the number of tributes, averaging around 180 pesos per 500 tributantes in each town. The abolition of the tribute in 1884 and the introduction of personal income tax, the cedula personal, eliminated the diezmos or the tithes and the sanctorum as distinct taxes. Nevertheless, it appears that the collection of the sanctorum continued in a number of municipalities until the end of Spanish rule, with a system that involved the coordination of native officialdom and the parish priest. The salary of the priest was consequently fixed at a rate of 12.5% of the town's revenue. Hence, the more people and revenue, the larger the clerical salary. In 1889, however, the priest's salary was standardized by Madrid's Ministerio de Ultramar, Overseas Ministry or Colonial Office, following a scheme that classified parishes according to the population of each town. This clerical salary was further subjected to 10% taxation. The final systematization of clerical salaries in 1889 was perhaps partly the outcome of a campaign in La Solidaridad that condemned an anomalous situation that was draining the colonial treasury. In an anonymous article simply titled 100,000 minus 12.5% equals X, La Solidaridad bemoaned that the parish priest's salary was 12.5% of the revenue of each municipality, and they critiqued government for the seeming baselessness of the rate. This flexible scheme was inevitably susceptible to manipulation, and La Solidaridad accused the friar parish priests, who after all controlled the municipal padron or tax list, of gaming the system by inflating the statistics for personal gain. Note that before the funds were sent to the central government in Manila, the parish priest and the local tax collectors would have already taken their share from the municipal revenue. La Solidaridad urged the Manila government to exercise stringent control in overseeing the municipal collection of taxes. When the friars criticized the Ministerio de Ultramar for a policy proposal in 1889 that effectively asserted more control over colonial revenue, La Solidaridad defended the Spanish government. Madrid's proposal contained two provisions that minimized the intervention of the friars in the collection of taxes. Article 3 directed local governments to remit revenues to the Manila Treasury in their integrity, and Article 15 provided fixed amounts for the fondos de fabrica and clerical salaries, conforming to a new parish classification scheme. La Solidaridad perceptively saw the friars' criticism of the proposed policy that, sorry, La Solidaridad perceptively saw that the friars' criticisms of the proposed policy were attempts at maintaining, to their advantage, a state of colonial anomie or lawlessness. Now, I'm quoting the article that the Ilustrados wrote. What perhaps the friars in the Philippines cannot accept is being placed on equal footing with the parochial clergy of the other provinces of Spain. They cannot be satisfied with the fixed stipend that Article 15 of the proposal establishes. And as such, they are being unreasonable. Either they have not pondered it, or they merely seek to maintain economic dysfunction or desbarajuste in this matter. End quote. Conflicts between native local officials and the Spanish friars on the issue of taxation confirmed the Ilustrados' diagnosis and affirmed the call for stronger state intervention. In 1895, the municipal council in Malolos, Bulacan, along with several Spanish and native notables, had become openly belligerent towards the friar parish priest. The friar had apparently withheld his authorization from the native gobernadorcillo to collect the cedulas personales after discovering that there were allegedly thousands who were illegally excused by the gobernadorcillo from paying taxes. The friar, having been incapacitated in exercising his ministry, called upon the Governor General in Manila, in his capacity as vice-royal patron, to punish the municipal council, almost all of whom were Freemasons. In 1896, in Taal, Batangas, the lawyer Felipe Agoncillo, along with several municipal officials, all of whom were also Freemasons, had reportedly demoralized the town politically and religiously, resulting into the absolute separation of the people from the friar parish priest. Agoncillo and his group had purportedly gained the support of the people by dispensing favors, granting exemptions from the payment of the cedulas personales and labor obligations, as well as manipulating administrative processes. The deficit in the town's revenue was hefty, amounting to more than 28,000 pesos. In both cases, the colonial government deported the accused officials to the island of Mindanao. Corruption in local government was commonplace in the Spanish colonial period and hardly scandalized the populace. So, the main issue at hand was the refusal of Filipino local officials to recognize the friar as the conduit of sovereign power in the local level. Beyond simply being anti-friar, Filipino nationalists were critics of administrative chaos that needed rationalization and coherence. They bemoaned that the islands were being governed as an exception and that such exception was fostered by the friars. Following from this latter point, imperial strategy itself upheld exception, which was an incoherence, as a constitutive foundation of Spanish sovereignty. Overcoming incoherence necessitated stronger state power and eventually revolution. I'm trying to move the narrative now so that we could end. The outbreak of the Philippine Revolution against Spain in 1896 was a shift that provided Filipinos the opportunity to assert the nascent Philippine nation state's sovereign authority to address the contradictions of Spanish colonialism. The revolutionary government established in 1898, which in 1899 was inaugurated as the first Philippine Republic, adopted the framework of ecclesiastical patronage as it had been in post-colonial Latin American republics earlier in the 19th century. But while Spain allowed the church sovereignty, the nascent Philippine Republic held a tight grip on ecclesiastical affairs. The initial response of Filipino revolutionaries towards the friars, the agents of the Ancien regime, was violence. The first phase of the revolution from 1896 to 1897 was led by the anti-clerical Andres Bonifacio and the secret society that he founded called the Katipunan ng mga Anak ng Bayan. Following the revolution's outbreak, Bonifacio's men senselessly murdered 21 friars in the provinces of Cavite, Bataan, Tarlac, and Batangas. Although the Katipunan harbored intense anti-friar sentiments, it drew inspiration from the martyrdom of the three Filipino priests in 1872, whose anniversaries it commemorated religiously. Attitudes towards the friars likewise varied within the secret society. Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of the Katipunan's Magdalo faction, opposed Bonifacio's execution of three other friars, for whose lives Aguinaldo had pleaded with Bonifacio. The execution of the friars widened the chasm between Bonifacio and Aguinaldo, who denounced the former's action as that of cruel atheists. Bonifacio was executed on orders of Aguinaldo in 1897. Nevertheless, the persecution of the Spanish friars continued under Aguinaldo. Following a short armistice in 1897, Aguinaldo returned to the Philippines from exile in Hong Kong on the 19th of May 1898 aboard an American ship to revive the revolution. He initially set up a dictatorial government, which gave way to a revolutionary government, both of which he was the president. In the course of this second revolutionary phase, Aguinaldo's troops captured and imprisoned a total of 400 Spanish friars in various places of the archipelago. Aguinaldo's men subjected the friars to hardships, humiliations, torture, and public disgrace in what was identified by one historian as a policy of severity that was not only political retribution but a strategy to seize the friars' funds and properties to support the revolution. The attitudes of Filipinos nonetheless varied, and a number of civilians aided and defended the friars against the abuses inflicted upon them by Aguinaldo's troops. Now, according to my research, the imprisonment of the friars, although on the surface appearing as sheer retribution, was for the most part a strategy to assert the sovereignty of the Philippine state. Over the course of a year, from 1898 to 1899, the Aguinaldo regime engaged in the politics of recognition that involved the US and the Vatican. The US was on the cusp of annexing the Philippines following the end of the Spanish American War, whilst the Vatican was anxious to secure church property and personnel at a time of intense political upheaval. Through formal diplomacy, the Aguinaldo government used its imprisonment of Spanish friars as leverage to facilitate the Philippinization of the Catholic hierarchy and, more broadly, to obtain recognition of Philippine sovereignty. Despite Aguinaldo's efforts, the US and the Vatican only came to view the imprisonment of the friars as evidence of Filipino barbarity and political incapacity. Notwithstanding the Questione Romana, the Philippine state viewed the Vatican's recognition as an important factor in its politics of recognition. Hence, the Vatican's withholding of recognition was a rejection of Philippine sovereignty and evidently a nod to the impending US conquest. The revolution envisioned the elimination of the influence of the friars from church and state through the adaptation of three interlinked statist goals. First was the establishment of ties with the Vatican, which was to be done through the negotiation and signing of a Philippine Vatican Concordat. Second, the Concordat would have formally established the Philippine state's patronage of the Church. Third, with the conferment of the right of patronage, the Philippine state would be able to rapidly Philippinize the church hierarchy and remove the Spanish friars from control of both civil and ecclesiastical realms. Internally, the Aguinaldo regime was deliberating the parameters of this patronage. The debate on church state separation in the Malolos Congress, which occurred in the latter months of 1898, was a debate on the manner by which the state was to regulate religion. Eventually, Congress instituted the separation of church and state in the Constitution, a provision that was passed with a tie broken by a mere one vote. What is startling is that Apolinario Mabini, the anti-clerical advisor of Aguinaldo and himself a separationist, suggested the suspension of the separation provision to foster unity during the revolution. More than just a pragmatist, Mabini was first and foremost a 19th century intellectual convinced that the state, or the people, had the inherent power to shape the contours of religion and church-state relations. The Malolos Constitution was promulgated on the 21st of January 1899, whilst the First Philippine Republic was inaugurated on the 23rd of January. Although formally instituting the expulsion of the Spanish friars and bishops from Philippine territory, Mbini successfully convinced Aguinaldo to issue a transitory provision in the Constitution suspending the separation of church and state and mandating local governments to continue paying the salaries of the local parish priests. The anti-clerical Mabini, of all people, paved the way for the continuation of ecclesiastical patronage in the post-Spanish colonial Philippines. Government's ecclesiastical policies, however, were not uniformly accepted by the Filipino clergy, who mostly rejected state oversight in church affairs. The appointment of parish priests and ecclesiastics was the first point of contention. Initially, the Aguinaldo government asserted oversight of the appointment of parish priests through a process that was tantamount to exequatur. Candidates who received their appointments from the Spanish archbishop and bishops needed to present themselves for authorization by the Worship Bureau or the Dirección de Cultos of the Justice Department, the Secretaría de Gracia y Justicia. Exequatur was a compromise that conceded powers of intervention to the Aguinaldo regime whilst respecting the canonical prerogatives of the incumbent Spanish bishops, whom the regime detested. However, the government itself contradicted and invalidated this policy when, in asserting more control over the church, Aguinaldo appointed Padre Gregorio Agripay as military vicar general, Vicario General Castrense. A strong partisan of the regime, Agripay encouraged his fellow priests to renounce the authority of the Spanish prelates. Consistent with this tendency, numerous municipal and provincial officials requested priests not from the bishops but from the Aguinaldo government. The situation forced the Filipino clergy into a crisis of conscience, a dilemma between loyalty to government policy or faithfulness to ecclesiastical procedure. The dilemma was grounded on the papacy's indirect repudiation of the patronato through the condemnation of government exequatur in Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors. His successor, Pope Leo XIII then introduced the doctrine of two perfect societies, societas perfecta, of church and state, asserting the church's right to a separate corporate existence. Societas Perfecta evidently sought to reify the once permeable borders of church and state, thus settling the contradictions of the Patronato. Whilst some Filipino clergymen offered restrained critique of Aguinaldo's policies, there were those who were not so subtle. For example, Padre Agustin de la Peña, the Filipino ecclesiastical governor sede plena of the Diocese of Haro in Iloilo, issued a long missive to his fellow priests in which he argued that, quote, civil and ecclesiastical authorities should be mutually independent as two perfect societies, end quote, aiming towards an advantageous coexistence necessary for Filipinos who were both citizens of the Republic and members of the Catholic Church. Church property was the second point of contention between the clergy and the regime. As soon as Aguinaldo was able to organize a functioning bureaucracy, his finance department, the Secretaría de Hacienda, undertook a systemic confiscation of ecclesiastical properties, following the example of the Spanish desamortización, by which the state exercised its supposed right to sequester unproductive lands held in mortmain. Officials of the Republic legalized the repossession of church properties by integrating it in the very fabric of the Constitution, especially in an additional article that restored church properties to the state and limited the value of the properties that religious orders possessed in the Philippines. The corpus of government decrees and memoranda likewise gave the confiscations an aura of legality. Animated by these ideas, government confiscated the friars' extensive estates that were the source of political agitation on the part of the wealthy native lessees or inquilinos. Government also seized all other kinds of ecclesiastical lands that were connected to endowments for pious purposes, such as the capellanias or chantries, and other charitable institutions, although these were not necessarily owned by friars. Valuable parish properties such as liturgical ornaments, books, statues, vessels, and even sacramental wine were also sequestered. State oversight extended to ecclesiastical finance. Following Aguinaldo's injunction, municipal councils provided the salaries of the parish priest and limited how much they could earn from the performance of sacraments by directly regulating the parish's schedule of stole fees, or what we have learned to call arancel. Aguinaldo's troops seized money from the friars, a violence that they applied even to Filipino clergy when they raided parishes for money. At one point, Aguinaldo requested Aglipay to invest all parish funds in a national loan in what was a move to generate funds for a cash-strapped government. Opposition to government's policy on church property came in earnest from the Filipino clergy. Padre Mariano Sevilla, a leading figure of the Filipino clergy who had the ear of government, advised Aguinaldo that the only legitimate spoils of war were the personal properties of the Spanish friars. Properties that belong to the parish, including funds, cannot be confiscated and must be turned over to the Filipino priest filling in for the Spanish friar. Padre Manuel E. Rojas, Aguinaldo's director of worship in 1898, echoed Sevilla's opinion, emphasizing that other ecclesiastical properties such as the actual church building, the rectory, cemeteries, and endowments must be turned over to the Filipino clergy. Money caused many squabbles as Filipino clergy questioned the authority of local officials to regulate the arancel and curtail clerical salaries. I have two more sections, so bear with me. The crisis of church and state in the Philippines at the turn of the century compelled Spain, the Holy See, and the friars to confront the viability of an imperial strategy founded on structural incoherence. So now, from the Philippines, we now move up to the Vatican and the United States. And Madrid. The Spanish government's initial response to the revolution was to salvage the policy of depending on the friars as what they called foundations of Spanish sovereignty, excusing the unrestrained power of the Spanish friars and even encouraging their intervention in local government. Governor General Fernando Primo de Rivera in 1897 suggested to the government in Madrid that the friars alone should run the parishes and that the native clergy should be phased out to suppress the spirit of separatism. Primo de Rivera, however, advised the government that it should have a tighter grip on the friars through the patronato, specifically by strengthening the power of the bishops, regulating the fees for sacraments, and most controversially, liquidating the friars' extensive haciendas. But the Spanish government quickly realized that it was no longer sustainable to uphold a strategy that had caused their troubles in the first place. Disagreeing with his predecessor, Governor General Ramon Blanco frankly admitted in 1898 that the friars' acquisition of vast political power was unreasonable and that the abuse of that power led to the outbreak of the revolution. Although he blamed the native clergy for the propagation of anti friar sentiment and separatist ideas, Blanco acknowledged that native resentment was a direct result of the friars' overbearance. Segismundo Moret, the Ministerio de Ultramar in Madrid, agreed with Blanco and gestured towards ending, once and for all, the influence of the friars in colonial governance. For to continue depending on friar power would only lead to Spain's definitive loss of the Philippines. Madrid also consulted the Holy See on the reformation of ecclesiastical policy in the Philippines, but Rome had differing ideas that, whilst accommodating Spanish aims, also asserted Rome's independence in church affairs. Although neither Spain nor the Vatican had thought of the end of the Patronato at that time, the intervention of the Holy See at the end of the century marked what some ecclesiastical historians call the entrance of Rome in the affairs of the Philippine Church. Vatican Secretary of State Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro proposed the strict enforcement of the rules of the religious orders and the subjection of the friar curates to episcopal control, both measures meant to curtail abuses. Whilst Madrid pushed for the eradication of Filipino priests, Rome advocated for their uplift so that they could render better service to both church and state. Finally, Rampolla proposed the appointment of an apostolic visitor that would report on church conditions in the islands directly to Rome, an act that disregarded the Spanish patronato's passe regio, or exequatur. Muret agreed with most of Rampolla's proposals, but insisted, contrary to Rampolla and to what he himself wrote to Blanco, that friar abuse caused the revolution. Nothing was said about the apostolic visitor. Eventually, Muret simplified and streamlined the reformation of the friars by proposing the complete suppression of their political power and their total subjection to the authority of the local bishop. The discussion between Madrid and Rome only highlighted the futility of reverting to previous practice. On the 9th of April 1898, in what was probably a show of force, the provincial superiors of the four friar orders and the Jesuits told Governor General Ramon Blanco that the government had neglected to protect them from the revolutionaries and that the Spanish religious intend to leave the country en masse for reasons of safety. Blanco protested what he considered a drastic proposal and denied the friars' accusation of neglect. Following this meeting, the provincial superiors penned an extensive exposition, also known as the Friar Memorial of 1898, in which they asked Madrid to reinforce their support of the friars. Addressed to the Ministro de Ultramar and dated the 21st of April 1898, the exposition defended the friars from the accusation that they caused the revolution. It instead proffered Freemasonry, which had supposedly introduced separatist ideas, as the true cause of the revolution, and accused the Spanish government of neglecting the friars who had served them faithfully in the Philippines. By not proscribing Freemasonry and encouraging conversations on the secularization of public schools, the introduction of civil marriage, the freedom of the press, and the freedom of association, the friars argued that Spain had precipitated its own decline in the Philippines. In a separate exposition to Pope Leo XIII, which was a compendium of the longer exposition to the Ministro de Ultramar, the friars pleaded with the Pope to use his influence on the Spanish government to exercise its authority to oppose Freemasonry and therefore save the church and the colony. This is the last section. We're close. As conversations were taking place within Spanish, Vatican, and Filipino circles, the US arrived on the scene in 1898 to likewise assert its sovereignty to end the state of administrative chaos that had prevailed in the Philippines for centuries. The US did not do so through the dissolution of any relation with the powerful Catholic Church, but by controlling the terms of such relation and using it to its advantage. To a certain degree, 1898 equalized three regimes and placed them on the same plane. Thus, we could discern the through line of sovereignty and religion from Spain to the Philippine Republic and then to the Americans. The history of the relations of the US with the Catholic Church is tortuous, but a few key moments are illustrative. Religion figured immediately to the Americans as a problem to be solved. And in fact, one of US President William McKinley's first instructions was the immediate proclamation of religious liberty in the islands. Discourses of Spanish backwardness pervaded the American imagination, and the patronato of the past appeared as a medieval relic that had to be destroyed by a modernizing iconoclast. And indeed, the Catholic Church was immediately disestablished by the Americans. After interviewing native elites who had defected from the First Philippine Republic, the First Philippine Commission, or the Skerman Commission, sent by McKinley in 1899, concluded that there was a widespread animosity against the Spanish friars. The commission immediately recommended the expropriation of the haciendas of the friars to force them out of the Philippines. But the commission likewise discreetly, yet frantically, and perhaps perplexingly, advised Washington that they, quote, unanimously agreed most important American archbishop and regulars ordained priests should be sent to investigate because the natives were, quote, good Catholics but intensely hostile to archbishop and friars who are Spaniards, end quote. I'm quoting a telegram sent to the State Department from Manila. McKinley's response to this unusual request incited the collaboration of Washington and Rome in building an empire in the Philippines. Quote, under the seal of the utmost secrecy, sous le seu de plus secret, end quote, McKinley requested the Vatican to send Archbishop Placide Louis Chapelle to Manila to aid the government in resolving the matter. Chapelle was the Archbishop of New Orleans and was concurrently apostolic delegate to Cuba and Puerto Rico, and McKinley understood that Chapelle was an American patriot who worked to enthrone bishops in the Antilles who sympathized with the US. A French immigrant to America, Chapelle was previously an Americanist, and Americanism was the view that reconciled American political traditions such as the separation of church and state and free elections with Roman Catholicism. Against the backdrop of the rise of US empire in 1898, Pope Leo XIII condemned Americanism as a heresy in 1899 in his letter Testem Benevolentiae. Chapelle rejected Americanism shortly before he became Archbishop of New Orleans in 1897. The Vatican reciprocated what was effectively a tacit recognition on the part of the US president of the Roman pontiff's sovereign power, not so much as ruler of the papal states, but as pastor of the universal church. The Vatican extended Chapelle's jurisdiction to include the Philippines and instructed him to protect church property and ecclesiastics. Note that the Vatican only specified the Spanish friars and bishops and did not mention protecting the Filipino clergy. Chapelle, in fact, at one point requested the US military governor in Manila to banish Filipino priests. In Manila, Chapelle pursued a policy of what could be termed as critical accord, in which he refashioned the Spanish friars, the very source of political agitation, as the collaborators of the new American regime, thereby attempting to align Vatican demands with American interests. This policy was unsustainable, and Chapelle's tenure in Manila was mired with almost endless conflict with the American regime and the Filipino people, who detested what they considered the persistence of friar sovereignty. The failure of Chapelle's policy was caused by the arrival of William Howard Taft, who was assertive in resolving religious problems. Under Taft's administration as the first civil governor of the Philippines, American civil governor, several questions of church and state were confronted, but the sale of the friar lands and the exclusion of the friars were two of the most important issues that were at the heart of Filipino protests since the middle of the 19th century. To supplant Chapelle's critical accord, the Roosevelt administration sent Taft on a mission to the Holy See from June to July 1902, to negotiate several matters of church and state in the archipelago, but mainly revolving around the friars and their haciendas. To parry political intrigues, the Roosevelt administration took pains to frame the mission as a business matter, a supposed innocuous negotiation between the US government and the Vatican to purchase the friar lands. In reality, however, the US and the Vatican were negotiating a concordat, termed a contract by Taft, in which the Vatican was being required to expel the friars from the Philippines in exchange for the purchase of the haciendas and the resolution of other church property disputes with the colonial government. The concordat was never signed, as I found out, primarily because the Vatican refused to expel the friars outright. Nevertheless, to make up for its refusal, the Vatican agreed to generously cooperate with the Americans in finalizing the purchase, in disciplining the friars, but most of all in orienting the internal policies of the church in support of the colonial state. In 1910, during the promulgation of a new set of statutes to govern the Catholic Church in the Philippines, the Pope's representative in the islands boasted before American officials that, quote, the Catholic Church is the only potent force that could sustain social peace and tranquility, since the Catholic faithful are themselves the best guardians of public order and the most obedient subjects of the constituted authority, having as a divine precept the obligation of respecting and submitting themselves to the princes of the earth, who have received from God the authority for the correct temporal government of peoples. End quote. True to its word, the U.S. to the U.S., the Vatican lent its authority over the friars to compel the friars to sell their estates in 1903. When the US government insisted that the purchased sum be used by the Vatican to support the church in the islands, the Vatican readily asserted its power over the independent minded friars to surrender a portion of their income to create what was known in the Vatican as the Fondo Filipine, the Philippine Fund. This fund, at the US government's instigation, was applied to the needs of the church in the Philippines until it vanished from the coffers of the Vatican sometime after 1917, as I have discovered. Furthermore, in exchange for the purchase of the estates, the Vatican desisted from imposing the return of the friars wherever they were unwelcome. At the advice of the US government and the new American bishops who were appointed with the influence of the US, the Holy See declined suggestions by the friars to establish ecclesiastical territories for them to manage. Now, one incident that I want to conclude this paper with is very revealing, and it involved the Spanish Capuchin friars in Sariaya, Tayabas, now Quezon Province. It shows how church and state in the context of the US Empire functioned even when church and state were separate. In 1906, the townspeople in Sariaya had belligerently demanded the expulsion of the Capuchins from the parish through petitions, protests, and public demonstrations. Although not part of the four objectionable friar orders of Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, and Recollects, the Capuchins became an easy target of native discontent, primarily because they were Spanish. They had been installed in Sariaya by Jorge Barlin, the Filipino bishop of the Diocese of Nueva Cáceres, after Barlin had himself expelled the Filipino parish priest there. Seeing the disturbance caused by this, the insular government pressured the church to withdraw the Capuchins by invoking a private agreement between Taft and the Pope's representative in Manila at the wake of the friar lands purchase, in which the church was instructed not to send friars where they were unwelcome. Eventually, the Capuchins were withdrawn from Sariaya by Bishop Berlin. It was under the Americans that, paradoxically, the incoherence of church-state relations in the Philippines were given a semblance of order, although that order was never absolute. The convergence of the US and the Vatican in projecting an empire was a demonstration of how political power works through religious channels that supplanted the institutional improvisations of the past. Now, to conclude, reconsidering the history of church and state in the Philippines reveals that secularism is really about shifting assertions of political sovereignty. Under Spanish rule, the Patronato Real created profound institutional incoherence as the colonial state's reliance on friars to project power ultimately fueled the administrative chaos that sparked the Philippine Revolution. Revolutionary Filipinos subsequently sought to establish post colonial coherence by aggressively subjugating the church to the nascent republic's sovereign authority. Ultimately, it was the American colonial regime that imposed some semblance of order that was less a rupture from the past and more of a reconfiguration of how the state controlled the church for its own ends. The Philippine case thus forces us to reevaluate how the history of secularization in other contexts could be understood. Instead of taking for granted the secularization thesis, historians should rather ask how secularism, as a technology of power that puts religion in its place, has been reincarnated in different epochs and places across the world. And I have just ended that very long paper, and I'm very sorry. And I'll open the floor for a discussion and a few questions. Thank you.
All right. Diyos mabalos, Dr. Kalakday, Mano, for this very, very thought-provoking paper on secularism as a form of sovereignty, how it's been reincarnated or reinvented across centuries, not to mention across colonial periods as well, and also periods in our national history. You made mention of the propaganda movement, the revolution, Aguinaldo's regime. Grabe, no? Talagang nag-iba-iba lang yung form, iba-iba lang itong pag-execute nila kaining patronage sa simbahan na tiga-argue mo kasubago. I've been following your work since our time in Ateneo de Manila, and this seems to me it's as if you summarized everything that you have done so far through this paper. Starting from your undergrad days until, of course, you had your MA at Yale and then a PhD at Cambridge. This is a summary of what you have been doing so far. And honestly, it brought me back to this issue of Philippine studies, itong 2021 issue na magkaibanan kita. Tapos yaon man duman si Coelho, yaon si Johaina Crisostomo. Tapos magayonon sa introduction duman ni Sergio Aguilar, ano? He talked about the Patronato Real. And then mas nagkaigo ako ni appreciation duman sa sadiri kong ginibong essay na tigi-invoke na panganiban so patronage kang civil government sa UST, no? Kaya pala nindatig pa para sabihan na kung Royal University ang UST, ano ta Dominicans ang may nag-handle, no? Nagkakapot kang temporal, even the spiritual affairs of the university. Dapat igwang igwang say digdi ang civil government, let alone itong inaapod tang Vice Royal Patron, itong Governor General. Garo baga nangyayari kaya baliktad na itong Governor General, itong Alkalde Mayor, garo nagiging sunod-sunudan sa mga praile, sa arsobispo, sa obispo, no? And we see that dynamic, but at the same time, we also see the state um, regulating religion in the colony in different epochs. So basically, this is a summary of what you have been developing and what you have been pursuing over the years. And it's great to see it in one article, ano? Tig-submit mo na ini for, ano, for publication.
Iyon na
Iyon na.
hurhaloy ang ang pag peer review. Pero
Iyon.
tama ka, yun nga digdi ko minaawot na masabutan kung ano ba talaga ini na sinasabot ta bilang church-state relations. Day ako nag ano, day, bako inahali sa dissertation ko. Parte kan mga kan sections kay ini hali sa dissertation su datos pero bako mismo ini na article hali sa dissertation manlain-lain ta American period and dissertation ko uni nagpun ako sa Spanish colonial period. Ang minaabot ko talaga na masabutan na okay, ano ini paano sinasabot ang secularism sa Pilipinas? Dakula kong nababasa, lalo na ngunyan baga, pag nagsasabi, church-state separation. Ang mga abogado, masabi, ay ngaya, daing ngaya kita secular, sabi kan constitution, abot sa nadigdi ang ang simbahan pero nag-influence ang simbahan. Pero sa kuya, ang paghiling ko kayan, garo sala ang formulation. Kaya pag nagsusurat ngayaan sarong may saro diyan na pandit sa Rappler na nagsusurat na ay ngaya ini araw ngaya kay ni grabe nga yung impluwensya kan simbahan. Talagang na dahil man ako naanggot na uyam ako, sabi ko niya ako, ultimately, sa at the end of the day, bako man ang simbahan ang nagsasabing, oh, dahil nga kita maggamit ng kondom, the reproductive health bill. Ang siya nagsasabi ka iyan, ang estado, ino sa gabot siya ang nag-execute kan or nag-interpret kan konstitusyon, ang estado. So sabi ko niya ako, garo bakong tugma dahil dakulaon na puzzle ini na secularism lalo na sa Pilipinas ta ang pag-isip ta ang Spanish period na kung saan grabe ang impluwensya kan simbahan. Pero um, mahiling tadigdi na sa sistema kan patronato ang simbahan yaon nakahirarom sa poder kan estado. As in, iyan ang uh, minawat kong hilingon across the periods. Nga bako sa ng Spanish period, bako sa ng ining Republican period, kundi mahiling mo iyan nagpadago sa mga Amerikano na tendency. Iyon ang pinapahiling ko. Ang kadaklan na literature sa secularism studies, critical secularism, kung babasahon kan sa tuyang mga kairibanan digdi kung nabasa na ninda si Talal Asad sarong antropologong Saudi na ano yan importante yun ang trabaho ni Asad sa pagkasabot na sa religion ang paghiling ninda kan secularism ang focal point ninda contemporary period so sa Egypt so Islamic State sa Egypt ngaya or so kung paano ang polisiya kan France sa Muslim women headdress kan mga kan Muslim women iyan ang ang parameters. Pero sa kuya, paano daw kung i-apply ta ini sa kasaysayan kan Pilipinas? Ang kasaysayan kan Pilipinas, secularization, gabos mag-sociology man yan, mag-anthropology man yan, gabos iyan ang pagkasabot 1898 dahil ng impluwensya ng simbahan. Pero ta ngunyan, sinasabi ta itong EDSA People Power Revolution dakulaon so impluwensya kan simbahan. Tapos ngunyan nagrereklamo ang dakol na mga kolumnista na grabe nga yung impluwensya kan simbahan. So, day bakong sistematiko ang pagkasabot ta kan secularism. So, this is my contribution. Tangani masabutan ta iyan. Day ko aram ko makakumbinsi. Tadakulo na kontra ka ini. Pero yan ang yan ang garo argument ko.
So no ko actually kung paano mo tig-complicate si notion kang secularism kasi masyadong simplistic ang pagkasabot na separation of church and state and that's it. Mayo ng iba. Tapos yun na nga niyan, ikaw pakitang mga what do you call that, itong mga tig-site mo kasi bago si Nakpil, was that Nakpil? Na stereotype ta ini mga colonial periods in our history na 300 years in a convent, tapos Hollywood 50 years or 40 years, and then nag-abot si mga Hapon. Dahil siya nakakatabang sa pag-complicate mo ning konsepto na ini, no, ning secularism. So, it's very, very interesting how you complexified this seemingly simple concept. Masyado siyang sinimplify or nireduce sa tuyang pag-adal ning kasaysayan sa Pilipinas. Okay, we have time for a question or two from our audience. Igo pa kamong mga gustong i-input kay Jethro. All right. Mayo man questions. I'm looking at the GCs mayo man so far. Okay. Mano, magayon na maray ining sa imong paper and I look forward to seeing it published in the pages of a journal, kung ano man na journal yan. And we wish you all the best with the review process. Dahil pa siya na-peer review, tama ba? Sorry, naka-mute ka.
Ngunyan under review na siya.
Under review na. Yeah.
Oo, apat apat o anom ang mabasa. So,
Pinakulod.
iyan. Ito halabaon.
Magkano ng apod kay quadruple blind review na bagayan ano, at least
Yeah.
quadruple. Okay.
Mm,
Thank you very much for your time and for joining us this
mm.
afternoon. This session is being recorded, so it will be uploaded on YouTube if you don't mind, so that it could reach more people even after the conference today. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your work with us. It has been a pleasure moderating your session, as always. So, Mano, we wish you good luck with this paper.
Yeah.
We look forward to seeing it published in the pages of the journal.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just
Thank you
mabalos
very
man
much.
sa Indoga, boss.
Mabalos na maray, Mano. All right. So, for those who are still in the session, in the Zoom meeting, kindly take a look at the meeting chat. And may I ask Reg to please send the Zoom, sorry, is that the evaluation link? This was prepared by the committee. Paki-share, please. And for those who would like to get their certificates, we do invite you to fill out the evaluation form prepared by the Secretariat Committee of the conference. Automatic na pong ma-generate ning certificate ining form na ini. All you have to do is to fill out all the required fields for you to claim your certificate. I think i-email sa Indo shortly after you submit your responses. All right, this has been fun. It's been a very long day. Pero sana kadakol kitang naguno no na bagong insights, mga kahaputan. I'm sure there are questions too na dahil na lang nasambit sa tuyang conference ko na aldaw. But let's keep the conversation going. Thank you very much for joining us para sa mga yaon sa YouTube. Mabalos na maray sa pag-antabay online and ining mga nasa Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us until the very end. So, that's it for day one. And for day two, tomorrow, it will be a by invitation only session at the Archbishop's residence. They're going to have a workshop on the archives, the Bicol Ecclesiastical Archives. Okay, so that would be all for today. Thank you very much. And this has been Jai Rogeria, your moderator for this afternoon. Mabalos na maray po sa pag-anduyog sa Saysay Bicol. And as we always say, para sa orog kararumpang pagsaysay. Thank you and have a good evening, everyone.